When the thermometer hits minus 55 degrees, most people lock their doors and pray their pipes don't freeze. But on a windswept ranch west of Mandan, North Dakota, Stephanie Hatzenbuehler faced a life-or-death decision that would test everything she knew about cattle survival. As the polar vortex of January 2019 descended like nature's hammer, this rancher was about to discover that sometimes the most desperate plans become legendary acts of survival. The radio crackled to life in the mild, pre-dawn darkness of January 27, 2019. Stephanie Hatzenbuehler pulled her wool cap tighter as the National Weather Service delivered news that would make even seasoned North Dakota ranchers pause. Polar vortex moving south, wind chills of negative 55 degrees, possibly life-threatening. Outside her kitchen window, the Diamond J. Angus Ranch stretched across the frozen prairie like a moonscape. Steam rose from the heated water tanks scattered across the pastures, each one a lifeline for her Black Angus herd. The mercury hadn't climbed above zero in 3 weeks, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Stephanie's husband, John, emerged from the barn, his breath forming crystalline clouds that hung in the still air. Even the wind seemed frozen in place, waiting for what meteorologists were calling the most dangerous weather event in decades. The couple had been ranching this land for over 15 years, weathering droughts, blizzards, and market crashes, but nothing had prepared them for what the atmosphere was about to unleash. The polar vortex had split into 3 pieces after a rare, sudden stratospheric warming event over the Arctic. One piece was heading straight for the American heartland, carrying with it temperatures that hadn't been recorded in this region for over 2 decades. Stephanie knew the science behind it mattered little to her 300 head of cattle. What mattered was survival. The Hatzenbuehler's Diamond J. Angus operation wasn't just a business, it was a legacy built on the unforgiving prairie soil. Their registered Black Angus cattle represented years of careful breeding, genetic planning, and financial investment. Each cow carried bloodlines that traced back generations, and each calf born represented the future of their ranch. As dawn broke with an eerie orange glow, Stephanie walked the fence lines, checking for weak spots that might fail under the coming assault. The snow beneath her boots squeaked with that particular sound that only happened when temperatures dropped below minus 20. Her cattle stood huddled in groups, their thick winter coats already frosted with ice crystals. They seemed to sense what was coming. Northeastern North Dakota cattle rancher Dan Rovig had warned that cold temperatures become a brutal, brutal thing when they reach minus 40 degrees. But this was going beyond brutal. This was entering territory where the difference between life and death could be measured in minutes. The ranch's emergency protocols were already in motion. Extra hay had been distributed, water tanks checked twice daily, and the backup generators tested. But as Stephanie studied the weather maps on her phone, she realized their standard cold weather preparations might not be enough. The forecast showed a solid week of temperatures that would challenge every system they had in place. If you're watching from somewhere warm right now, drop a comment and let us know where you're staying cozy while we dive into this Arctic survival story. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of human determination. By noon, the first edge of the polar air mass had arrived. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 1 hour. Stephanie's digital thermometer read minus 22 and falling fast. The cattle began moving restlessly, their instincts telling them to seek shelter. That didn't exist on the open prairie. This was the moment when theory met reality, when all the preparation in the world might not be enough. The Hatzenbuehlers faced a choice that would define not just the next week, but possibly the future of their entire operation. They could follow standard cold weather protocols and hope for the best, or they could attempt something that had never been tried before on their ranch, something that seemed desperate enough to work, or desperate enough to fail catastrophically. As the afternoon sun disappeared behind a wall of approaching Arctic air, Stephanie made the decision that would either save her herd or cost her everything. The thermometer read minus 31, and the real cold hadn't even arrived yet. Time was running out, and nature was about to test the limits of both human ingenuity and bovine endurance. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the promise of temperatures that would redefine what cold meant in North Dakota. In the distance, her cattle began to gather near the windbreaks, sensing the approach of something beyond their experience. Little did they know that their rancher was about to make a choice that would determine whether they would see another sunrise. January 29th arrived like a slap from the Arctic gods themselves. The digital display on the ranch's weather station read -39 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind hadn't even started yet. In Bismarck, just 40 miles east, the temperature had already broken a record set in 1910, hitting -39 degrees. But breaking records was the least of Stephanie Hatzenbüller's concerns as she stepped outside into what she would later call the Siberian experience. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing breath and burning exposed skin within seconds. Even through her insulated coveralls and face mask, the Arctic air found ways to penetrate, turning her eyelashes to ice and making each breath feel like swallowing. Glass shards. This wasn't weather. This was nature's attempt at absolute zero made manifest on the prairie. Inside the barn, the contrast was stark, but deceptive. While the structure provided wind protection, the temperature barely climbed above -10. Stephanie could hear her cattle moving restlessly in the pastures beyond, their low moos carrying an urgency that every rancher learns to recognize. They were telling her something was wrong, something beyond their ability to endure. The Hatzenbüller family had been contending with the cold in many ways on their ranch west of Mandan, from their carving operation to vehicles and equipment starting to their coal-fired furnace keeping up. But this was testing systems that had never been designed for such extremes. The diesel fuel in their tractors had begun to gel despite additives. The hydraulic lines on their equipment were stiffening like frozen snakes. The cattle themselves were facing physiological challenges that pushed the boundaries of their survival mechanisms. A cow's lower critical temperature, the coldest they can handle without added calories to burn, rests right around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. For every degree colder than that, each animal required a 1% increase in energy just to survive. At -39, her herd needed nearly 75% more calories just to maintain basic bodily functions. But calories meant nothing if the animals couldn't access food. The hay bales scattered across the pastures had frozen into solid blocks harder than concrete. The cattle's breath formed ice masks around their muzzles, making eating difficult, even when food was available. Their water sources, despite heated tanks, were beginning to show signs of stress as the heating elements struggled against the relentless cold. Stephanie's emergency protocols were failing one by one. The backup generator for the main water system had started, run for 2 hours, then shut down when its coolant. Lines froze. 3 of the heated water tanks had ice forming around their edges, despite functioning heating elements. The portable shelters they had erected were providing wind protection but little warmth. As if the ranchers needed more subscribers to their weather nightmare, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button for more stories of survival against impossible odds. Most critically, calving season was still in full swing. Extreme cold in late January had led to increasing checks on cows from every 2 hours to every hour. Newborn calves exposed to these temperatures had perhaps 10 minutes before hypothermia became irreversible. If you missed something and it had a calf, it was froze, Stephanie later recalled. You have to pick them up within about 10 minutes or they weren't doing very well. The ranch's cattle began exhibiting behaviors that Stephanie had never witnessed before. They huddled so tightly together that from a distance they looked like a single enormous organism breathing steam into the crystalline air. Some animals had frost forming on their eyelashes so thick it impaired their vision. Others were lifting their hooves repeatedly, trying to keep their feet from freezing to the ground. By evening, the wind arrived with the fury of a freight train. Gusts reached 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to levels that existed more in theoretical calculations than real-world experience. Grand Forks, 200 miles northeast, would eventually record a wind chill of -65 degrees. On the Diamond J Ranch, the anemometer stopped reading at -60 before the electronics themselves succumbed to the cold. Inside their house, the Hatzenbüllers could hear their coal-fired furnace struggling to maintain temperature. The walls themselves seemed to conduct the cold, creating frost patterns on the interior windows, despite the heating system running continuously. If the house was struggling, what chance did the animals have outside? That night, as temperatures continued their deadly descent, Stephanie made a series of phone calls to veterinarians and fellow ranchers. The consensus was grim. Traditional cold weather management wouldn't be sufficient. They needed something more radical, more desperate, something that had never been attempted on this scale in these conditions. As she hung up the phone, Stephanie looked out her frosted window at the huddled forms of her cattle. barely visible through the blowing snow and darkness. Tomorrow would bring the coldest temperatures in recorded history for their region. Traditional wisdom said cattle could survive almost anything if they had food, water, and wind protection, but this wasn't almost anything. This was the polar vortex, and it was about to test every assumption about livestock survival ever made. January 30th dawned with a temperature that defied comprehension, -47 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill had pushed the effective temperature below -70. At these extremes, metal became brittle as glass, rubber shattered like pottery, and the very act of breathing became a conscious effort to prevent lung damage. For the cattle on Diamond J Ranch, this wasn't just cold weather, it was an extinction event happening in real time. Stephanie Hatzenbuller's first indication that they were entering uncharted territory came when she tried to start the diesel-powered hay feeder. The engine turned over twice before the starter motor gave up, its internal components contracting beyond their designed tolerances. The hydraulic fluid had thickened to the consistency of honey, making it impossible to operate the equipment designed to deliver life-saving calories to her starving herd. The cattle themselves were beginning to show signs of severe hypothermic stress. Older cows and thin younger cows are most susceptible to extreme cold. Some of the animals had developed ice crusts around their nostrils, where their warm breath repeatedly froze and refroze. Others were showing the early stages of frostbite on their ears and tails, the extremities turning white as circulation became compromised. Even more concerning were the pregnant cows approaching their calving dates. Newborn calves are very susceptible to extreme cold, with frozen ears, tail and feet affecting the survivors. The combination of maternal stress from the cold and the impossibility of newborn survival created a crisis with no good solutions. Every calf born in these conditions would likely die within minutes, and the stress on the mothers could prove fatal as well. The ranch's infrastructure was systematically failing. 3 more water heating systems had shut down overnight as their electrical components succumbed to temperatures beyond their operational limits. The main barn's sliding doors had frozen shut, their tracks filled with ice that couldn't be chipped away without risking damage to the door mechanisms. Even the coal supply for their heating system was freezing into lumps that wouldn't feed properly through the automated systems. Stephanie's desperation grew as she witnessed scenes that would haunt her for years. Cattle were standing motionless, conserving every possible calorie for basic survival. Their usual behaviors, grazing, socializing, moving freely through the pastures, had ceased entirely. They had become living statues, breathing clouds of vapor that instantly crystallized and fell as snow around their hooves. If you're somewhere warm watching this story unfold, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible survival stories. The most heartbreaking sight was watching her cattle try to access the frozen hay bales. The animals would approach the feed, steam rising from their nostrils, only to discover that the hay had frozen into solid blocks that their teeth couldn't penetrate. Some cows attempted to lick the ice-covered nutrition, their warm tongues sticking momentarily to the frozen surface before they pulled away, leaving small patches of tissue behind. By midday, despite the sun reaching its highest point, the temperature had only warmed to -44 degrees. The wind continued its relentless assault, creating ground blizzards that reduced visibility to mere feet. Stephanie could barely see her cattle, even when standing directly next to the fence lines. The animals had formed tight circles, the larger cows on the outside protecting the smaller ones in the center, but even this ancient survival instinct wasn't enough against these conditions. The veterinary implications were becoming clearer with each passing hour. Thin cows in extreme cold may succumb to the elements. Several of her animals were already showing signs of severe metabolic stress. Their body condition scores, which had been acceptable at the beginning of winter, were being rapidly depleted as their systems burned fat reserves and muscle tissue to maintain core temperature. Most critically, the logistics of providing care had become nearly impossible. Walking to check on the animals required full Arctic gear that took 15 minutes to put on properly. Staying outside for more than 10 minutes risked serious frostbite. The normal, twice-daily feeding schedule had become physically impossible when the equipment wouldn't start, and the humans couldn't remain exposed long enough to complete basic tasks. That afternoon, Stephanie made a discovery that changed everything. While struggling to reach the cattle nearest to the barn, she noticed that a small group of cows had somehow gotten inside the Quonset hut where they stored grain. These animals were still cold, but they were alive, alert, and responsive in ways that their pasture-bound companions were not. The Hatzenbuehlers had removed wheat from their Quonset in January to use as shelter for about 100 pairs of cows and calves for the first time. It was an unprecedented decision, one that went against decades of ranching orthodoxy. Bringing cattle into enclosed spaces violated every rule about maintaining proper herd health and facility cleanliness. But as Stephanie looked at the difference between the cattle inside and outside, orthodoxy seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. The animals in the Quonset were showing none of the severe hypothermic symptoms plaguing the outdoor herd. Their breathing was normal, their eyes were clear, and most importantly, they were still moving voluntarily rather than standing motionless in survival mode. The decision that would save or doom her entire operation crystallized in that moment. Traditional ranching wisdom would have to be abandoned. The desperate plan forming in her mind had never been attempted at this scale, under these conditions, with this many lives at stake. But watching her cattle slowly freeze to death wasn't an option either. As the sun set on January 30th, bringing with it the promise of an even more lethal night, Stephanie Hatzenbuehler faced a choice that would haunt her forever if she got it wrong. The temperature was dropping toward -50 degrees, with wind chills that would make the outside air literally unsurvivable for extended periods. Her cattle were dying slowly, and every conventional solution had failed. Standing in her kitchen, Stephanie could hear the wind howling with supernatural intensity, driving snow against the windows like horizontal bullets. The sound was punctuated by the occasional crack of wood or metal, contracting beyond its limits. The prairie itself seemed to be breaking apart under the assault of Arctic air. Through the frost-covered glass, she could barely make out the huddled shapes of her cattle, darker shadows against the swirling white nightmare outside. The decision she was contemplating violated every principle of modern ranch management. Moving hundreds of cattle into enclosed spaces wasn't just unconventional, it was considered dangerous under normal circumstances. The risk of disease transmission, waste management problems, and structural damage could destroy everything they had built over decades of careful ranching. But these weren't normal circumstances. It was a very good idea. Otherwise, we would have probably had more issues. Stephanie would later reflect on the decision to use their Quonset building as emergency shelter. The small group of cattle that had already taken refuge there showed her what survival looked like compared to the slow death happening outside. The logistics of her plan were staggering. She needed to move nearly 300 head of cattle from their pastures to whatever sheltered spaces the ranch could provide. The main Quonset hut could hold perhaps 100 animals if they packed them tightly. The barn could accommodate maybe 50 more. The remaining cattle would have to be housed in whatever structures could be improvised, reinforced, or repurposed. John joined her at the kitchen table as she sketched out the emergency relocation plan on the back of a feed catalogue. Every building on the property was evaluated for its potential to keep cattle alive. The machine shop, the grain storage buildings, even the old chicken coop, everything was considered. They calculated square footage per animal, ventilation requirements, and structural load limits by the light of an oil lamp when the power flickered. The most critical factor was time. Moving cattle in these conditions would require multiple trips, with each journey outside risking both human and animal lives. For every degree colder than a cow's critical temperature of 32 degrees, it requires a 1% increase in energy to survive the cold. At -50, her animals were burning calories at an unsustainable rate just to maintain life, leaving no energy reserves for movement or stress response. Let your friends know about this incredible story of determination. Comment below and hit subscribe for more amazing survival stories from America's heartland. The couple worked through the night, preparing their buildings for an invasion of displaced livestock. Hay bales were arranged to create temporary partitions and bedding. Water systems were rerouted to reach the improvised shelters. Most critically, they calculated how much feed would be needed to keep 300 animals alive in confinement during what weather forecasts suggested could be a week-long siege. As midnight approached, the temperature outside reached -52 degrees. Through the window, they could see some of their cattle had stopped moving entirely. These animals weren't sleeping or resting. They were entering the final stages of hypothermia, where the body shuts down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature. In medical terms, they were dying. The decision point had arrived. They could continue following traditional wisdom, provide what shelter they could, ensure adequate feed and water, and accept the losses that such extreme weather inevitably brings. Every rancher in North Dakota had experienced winter losses. It was part of the brutal economics of raising livestock in one of the continent's most unforgiving climates. Or they could attempt something unprecedented, a complete emergency evacuation of their herd into whatever sheltered space they could provide. The risks were enormous. Panicked cattle could injure themselves or humans during the move. The buildings might not support the weight and waste of so many animals. Disease could spread rapidly in the confined spaces. The entire herd could be lost to causes other than cold. But as another gust of wind shook the house and the temperature dropped another degree, Stephanie made the call that would define her as a rancher. At 1 a.m. on January 31st, 2019, she and John bundled themselves in their heaviest winter gear and stepped into the polar apocalypse to begin the most desperate livestock rescue operation in North Dakota history. The cold hit them like a physical blow, instantly freezing their breath and making their eyes water tears that turned to ice on their cheeks. Visibility was measured in feet, rather than yards. The wind carried snow with the force of a sandblaster. Every step was a conscious effort to maintain footing on surfaces that had become slicker than ice. But somewhere in that howling darkness were 300 animals depending on their next decisions. The evacuation was about to begin, and failure meant watching their life's work freeze to death in the most extreme weather conditions the region had ever experienced. There would be no second chances, no margin for error. This was survival in its purest, most unforgiving form. At 1:17 a.m. on January 31st, 2019, with the thermometer reading -53 degrees and the wind howling at 45 miles per hour, Stephanie and John Hatzenbuehler began the most dangerous livestock operation of their lives. The ground crunched under their boots, with a sound like breaking glass as they trudged toward the first group of cattle, their flashlight beams creating cone-shaped tunnels through the swirling snow that illuminated nothing but horizontal white fury. The cattle closest to the barn had formed a tight huddle that looked more like a single massive creature breathing steam into the Arctic air. Individual animals were indistinguishable in the darkness and blowing snow. Some were lying down, whether from exhaustion, cold, or worse. Stephanie couldn't tell without getting close enough to risk her own safety in the killing wind. Moving cattle under normal conditions requires patience, understanding of herd dynamics and careful pressure, applied in the right directions. Moving cattle in a blizzard at -53 degrees, with wind chills approaching -80, defied every principle of safe livestock handling. Panicked animals could injure themselves or their handlers. Stress could trigger heart failure in older cows, already pushed to their physiological limits. But gentle persuasion was a luxury they couldn't afford. The first group of 20 animals needed to move immediately, or they would begin dying where they stood. John positioned himself on one side of the huddle, while Stephanie approached from the other, their movements coordinated by hand signals, since shouting was impossible in the wind. The cattle's response to human contact revealed just how close they were to complete systems failure. Animals that would normally move away from human pressure stood motionless, their energy reserves so depleted that basic flight responses had shut down. Some cows had ice formed around their eyes so thick they appeared blind. Others swayed slightly as they stood, their balance compromised by hypothermia affecting their nervous systems. Getting the first animals moving required physical contact, pushing against their shoulders, slapping their flanks, doing whatever it took to generate enough stimulus to overcome their cold-induced lethargy. The cattle moved like sleepwalkers, their steps uncertain and their responses delayed by several seconds as their frozen minds processed basic commands. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching this incredible survival story from. The dedication of these ranchers will amaze you. The 200-yard journey to the Quonset hut became an epic of endurance. The cattle moved at perhaps one-third their normal walking speed, stopping frequently to rest in positions that suggested they might simply lie down and give up. Every few steps, Stephanie and John had to encourage individual animals to continue, sometimes physically supporting cows whose legs were too stiff with cold to carry their weight reliably. Inside the Quonset hut, the temperature was still below freezing, but the absence of wind made it feel tropical compared to the conditions outside. As the first cattle entered the shelter, their behavior changed immediately. Animals that had been nearly catatonic outside began moving more normally, shaking ice from their coats and showing signs of alertness that had been absent for hours. But the shelter created new challenges. The building had never been designed to hold livestock, and the concrete floor became treacherous as snow melted off the animals' coats and refroze into black ice. The cattle, desperate for warmth, packed together so tightly that smaller animals risked being trampled by larger ones seeking the center of the protective huddle. Ventilation became critical. Too much air exchange would negate the warming effect of the shelter and animal body heat. Too little would create dangerous carbon dioxide buildup and ammonia accumulation from waste. Stephanie found herself opening and closing doors and vents throughout the night, trying to maintain a balance that would keep her animals alive without creating new ways for them to die. The second group of cattle proved even more challenging to move. These animals had been farther from shelter and showed more severe symptoms of hypothermia. Several cows were lying down and required physical assistance to stand. Others moved with the jerky, uncontrolled motions that indicated their nervous systems were being affected by the extreme cold. One elderly cow collapsed halfway to the shelter, her legs unable to support her weight. In temperatures that could kill exposed humans in minutes, John and Stephanie faced an impossible choice: attempt to move a 200-pound animal across icy ground in hurricane-force winds, or leave her to die. They chose the attempt, using ropes and pure determination to drag the semi-conscious animal to safety. By 3 a.m., they had successfully moved 60 animals into various sheltered spaces. The main Quonset was packed beyond any reasonable capacity, but the cattle inside were alive and showing signs of recovery. Their breathing was visible but not labored, their eyes were alert, and most importantly, they were beginning to move voluntarily rather than standing in survival mode. But 240 animals remained outside, and the night was far from over. The temperature had dropped to -55 degrees, the coldest reading in the station's history. Wind gusts were exceeding 50 miles per hour, creating ground blizzards that made visibility impossible beyond arm's length. Every trip outside to collect more animals risked not finding the way back. As dawn approached with no sign of warming, the Hatzenbuhlers realized they were attempting something that might be physically impossible. But stopping now meant watching the rest of their herd freeze to death in full view of the safety they couldn't reach. The evacuation would continue, animal by animal, until either all the cattle were saved or the rescuers joined them in the Arctic wasteland that North Dakota had become. February 1st brought no relief. The temperature held steady at -54 degrees, with wind chills that made stepping outside equivalent to entering a freezer set to kill. But inside the improvised shelters of Diamond J Ranch, something remarkable was happening. The cattle that had seemed destined for death were not just surviving, they were recovering. Stephanie Hatzenbuhler made her morning rounds through the overcrowded Quonset hut like a battlefield medic triaging wounded soldiers. The difference between the sheltered animals and those still trapped outside was stark enough to justify every protocol violation she had committed. Cattle that had been catatonic 12 hours earlier were now alert, responsive, and showing normal behaviors like grooming and social interaction. The emergency shelters had become their own ecosystems of survival. Body heat from the tightly packed animals had raised the internal temperature to nearly 20 degrees above zero. Still freezing, but a 70-degree improvement over the outside conditions. The cattle had instinctively arranged themselves in groups that maximized warmth sharing, with younger animals in the center and larger cows forming protective barriers around the perimeter. But success brought new challenges that tested every assumption about livestock management. The waste accumulation was staggering. 300 animals produces roughly 30 tons of manure per day under normal conditions. In confined spaces, with stressed animals and no way to clean facilities in the deadly cold, the buildings were becoming biohazardous environments that could threaten the very animals they were meant to protect. Water. Consumption had become a critical balancing act. Keeping water from freezing in extreme temperatures requires constant monitoring, with owners often checking water systems multiple times a day. But the sheltered cattle were drinking far more than their outdoor counterparts, their recovering metabolisms demanding hydration as their systems came back online. The ranch's water heating capacity was being pushed beyond design limits. Feeding presented equally complex problems. The cattle, that had barely touched frozen hay outside, were now consuming food at rates that threatened to exhaust the ranch's winter reserves. in days rather than months. Their bodies were rapidly replenishing fat reserves and muscle tissue that had been metabolized for survival during the coldest hours. Each animal needed 50% more calories than normal just to recover from their hypothermic ordeal. Subscribe to our channel and comment below with your location. We love hearing from viewers around the world who appreciate these incredible stories of perseverance. The logistics of caring for animals in buildings never designed for livestock created constant safety hazards. The concrete floors, slick with melted snow and ice, caused several animals to slip and fall. The standard electrical systems posed electrocution risks when mixed with the moisture and waste from livestock. Every decision created new potential disasters that had to be weighed against the certain death waiting outside. Most critically, several pregnant cows were approaching their calving dates under conditions that made delivery extremely dangerous. Cold weather stress is especially harmful to newborn calves, and cows that were challenged by winter weather may have weak calves that need extra help at calving. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the emergency shelters were the worst possible environment for bringing new life into the world. Yet somehow, against all veterinary wisdom and ranching experience, the system was working. The first calf born in the shelters arrived on February the 2nd, a healthy bull calf who stood and nursed within 20 minutes of birth. His mother, who had been near death from hypothermia 3 days earlier, proved that the desperate evacuation plan had given both their lives a second chance. The cattle outside told a different story. Despite heroic efforts to bring them hay and maintain their water sources, the animals still exposed to the full fury of the polar vortex were deteriorating rapidly. Some had developed severe frostbite on their ears and tails. Others showed signs of pneumonia as their compromised immune systems failed to fight off respiratory infections caused by breathing super-chilled air for days. The contrast drove home the stark mathematics of survival at these temperatures. The USDA Livestock Indemnity Program considers -40 wind chill as extreme cold for mature cattle. At -55 with wind, chills approaching -80, the Diamond J cattle were surviving conditions that exceeded government definitions of what livestock could endure. By February 3rd, the improvised refugee camps had found their rhythm. The cattle had established their own hierarchies and sleeping arrangements within the buildings. Feed distribution systems had been adapted to work in the confined spaces. Waste management, while far from ideal, was preventing the buildup of dangerous gases and toxins. Most remarkably, the animals showed signs of psychological recovery that surprised even experienced veterinarians. Cattle that had stood motionless for days were resuming normal behaviors, playing, exploring their new environment, and showing curiosity about their human caretakers. The social dynamics that cold stress had temporarily erased were reasserting themselves as the herd regained its collective strength. The success of the shelters created its own moral dilemma. The cattle outside were clearly suffering, but the buildings were packed beyond any reasonable capacity. Taking in more animals might compromise the safety of those already saved. Stephanie found herself making life and death decisions based on building capacity rather than need, the kind of choices that would haunt any rancher with a conscience. As the polar vortex entered its 5th day with no sign of weakening, the Diamond J Ranch had become a case study in crisis management and livestock survival. The desperate plan was working, but at costs that wouldn't be fully understood until long after the emergency had passed. February 4th dawned with the first sign of hope in a week. The temperature had risen to -47 degrees. While still deadly by any reasonable standard, this represented a 7-degree warming that felt like salvation to the exhausted ranchers of Diamond J. More importantly, the wind had finally begun to subside, dropping from hurricane force to merely gale strength and allowing visibility to extend beyond a few feet for the first time in days. Stephanie Hatzenbuehler stood in the doorway of the Quonset hut, watching her cattle adjust to the slightly less hostile world outside. The animals that had seemed destined for death a week earlier were now moving with purpose and energy that defied every prediction about livestock survival in extreme cold. Their recovery wasn't just medical, it was miraculous. The improvised shelters had become their own functioning communities. The cattle had organized themselves into family groups, with experienced mothers teaching younger animals how to navigate the crowded conditions. Feed distribution had evolved into a complex social protocol where dominant animals ensured the entire group received adequate nutrition rather than hoarding resources for themselves. But the warming trend brought new challenges that tested the limits of the emergency systems. As the temperature rose, ice that had been frozen solid began to melt, creating flooding problems in buildings never designed for drainage. The waste accumulation, which had been manageable when frozen solid, became a liquid nightmare that threatened to contaminate water sources and create disease outbreaks. Ventilation requirements changed dramatically as the cattle's metabolic needs shifted from pure survival to recovery mode. Animals that had huddled motionless for warmth were now generating excess heat through normal activity, creating humid conditions that promoted respiratory infections. Every door and window became a careful balance between fresh air and heat retention. The logistics of the evacuation had created supply chain problems that wouldn't be resolved for days. Feed consumption was running 200% above normal levels as the cattle replenished body mass lost during the coldest period. Water usage had similarly skyrocketed as animals that had barely drunk for days now consumed gallons as their systems rehydrated. Comment below with where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of survival and determination from America's agricultural heroes. Most critically, the success of the shelters had attracted attention from neighboring ranchers, facing their own survival crises. Phone calls came throughout the day from desperate cattlemen asking for advice, shelter space, or simply reassurance that survival was possible. The Hatzenbuhlers found themselves becoming an emergency resource center for an entire region of struggling ranchers. The cattle still outside presented the most heartbreaking decisions. Some animals had clearly suffered permanent damage from their week-long exposure to extreme cold. Frostbite had claimed ears, tails, and in some cases, entire hooves. These animals would survive but carry permanent reminders of their ordeal. Others showed signs of internal damage that might not become apparent for weeks or months. Yet even the most severely affected animals showed remarkable resilience once given access to shelter and adequate nutrition. Cattle that veterinary textbooks suggested should not have survived were not only alive, but showing signs of recovery that challenged medical understanding of hypothermia and cold stress. The first successful births in the shelters marked a symbolic turning point. 3 healthy calves were born between February 3rd and 5th, all to mothers who had been evacuated from the killing cold. Stephanie later noted that despite the challenging conditions, calving had actually gone better than previous years, probably because you're out there more, watching, you're more diligent, so you should be successful. The community response to the crisis revealed the deep connections that bind rural America together in times of disaster. Neighbors arrived with extra hay, portable heaters, and most importantly, additional hands. For the round-the-clock animal care the situation demanded, the emergency had become a collective effort that transcended individual ranch boundaries. Equipment that had failed during the coldest days began functioning again as temperatures moderated. Diesel engines started reluctantly but ran. Hydraulic systems regained enough flexibility to operate feed distribution equipment. The basic infrastructure of ranch life slowly returned to functionality as the polar vortex loosened its death grip on the region. By February 6th, the immediate crisis was clearly passing. Weather forecasts showed continued warming with temperatures rising into the -20s, still cold, but within the range of normal North Dakota winter conditions. The wind had dropped to levels that allowed normal outdoor work to resume. Most importantly, the cattle had demonstrated that with adequate shelter and nutrition, they could survive conditions that had seemed unsurvivable. The success of the desperate evacuation plan had saved not just the Diamond J herd, but provided a template for emergency livestock management that other ranchers could adapt to their own situations. The protocols violated conventional wisdom, but proved that desperate times could justify desperate measures when those measures were based on solid understanding of animal physiology and behavior. As Stephanie conducted her evening rounds through the shelters, the cattle that greeted her bore little resemblance to the near corpses she had evacuated a week earlier. They were alert, healthy, and showing normal behaviors that indicated full recovery from their traumatic ordeal. The desperate plan had worked, but the full cost of the polar vortex would only become clear as the region began the long process of recovery from one of the most extreme weather events in recorded history. The turning point had arrived, but the story of survival was far from over. March 15, 2019, arrived. With spring sunshine and temperatures in the 40s, a tropical paradise compared to the Arctic hell that Diamond J Ranch had endured 6 weeks earlier. Stephanie Hatzenbuehler walked through her pastures, now green with early grass, surveying cattle that should have been dead. The final count was staggering. Of her 300 head, 298 had survived the polar vortex. In a region where 20–30% winter losses were considered normal during extreme weather events, her desperate evacuation plan had achieved the impossible. The 2 animals lost had died not from cold but from injuries sustained during the emergency moves, casualties of rescue rather than victims of weather. Every veterinarian, agricultural extension agent, and fellow rancher who visited the Diamond J in the weeks following the crisis struggled to explain how such survival rates were possible under conditions that had killed thousands of animals across the northern plains. The physical evidence of the ordeal was everywhere. The Quonset hut would need complete renovation after housing livestock for a week. The concrete floors were permanently stained and would require replacement. The building's electrical systems needed rewiring after exposure to moisture and ammonia. The estimated cost of facility restoration exceeded $30,000, expensive by ranch standards, but a fraction of what replacing 300 head of registered Black Angus cattle would have cost. More importantly, the cattle themselves bore permanent reminders of their brush with death. Nearly half the herd showed some degree of frostbite damage, mainly cosmetic injuries to ears and tail tips. A dozen animals had lost hooves to frostbite and would require specialized care for months, but these were the lucky ones. Across North Dakota and neighboring states, thousands of cattle had died during the polar vortex, with some ranchers losing entire herds. The success of the Diamond J evacuation became a case study that reached far beyond ranch country. Agricultural colleges requested detailed accounts of the emergency protocols. Veterinary schools analyzed the survival data to better understand livestock hypothermia and recovery. The USDA incorporated lessons from the evacuation into their extreme weather preparedness guidelines. But for Stephanie, the most important lesson was simpler. Conventional wisdom has limits that desperate situations can transcend. There's always something new to learn and something new to experience. It doesn't matter how many times you've done this, so you have to adapt. The polar vortex had demanded adaptations that violated every rule of proper livestock management, yet those violations had saved lives. If you've enjoyed this incredible story of survival and determination, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like these remind us of the incredible resilience of both animals and the people who care for them. The economic impact of the survival strategy extended beyond the immediate savings of avoiding livestock losses. The genetic value of the preserved breeding stock represented decades of careful selection and bloodline development. Bulls and cows that had cost thousands of dollars and years of breeding programs continued producing offspring that would improve the herd for generations. Perhaps most significantly, the emergency revealed capacities in both humans and animals that neither knew they possessed. The cattle had survived conditions that veterinary science said should have killed them. The ranchers had worked in temperatures that safety experts said were unsurvivable for extended periods. Both species had found reserves of endurance that redefined what was possible under extreme conditions. The broader implications reached into climate science and agricultural planning. The polar vortex event was attributed to sudden stratospheric warming that split the Arctic air mass, an occurrence that some scientists connected to broader climate change patterns. If such extreme events were becoming more common, the emergency protocols developed at Diamond J might become standard practice rather than desperate improvisation. The story attracted national media attention, with agricultural publications and mainstream news outlets featuring the dramatic rescue operation. The narrative resonated beyond farming communities, capturing public imagination as an example of American determination and innovative problem-solving under impossible circumstances. Today, the Diamond J Ranch continues operating with systems modified by the lessons of the polar vortex. Emergency shelter capacity has been expanded and formalized. Feed reserves are calculated not just for normal winter conditions, but for extended extreme weather events. Water systems have backup heating that can function even when primary power fails. The cattle themselves seem to carry cellular memories of their survival experience. During subsequent winter storms, They move toward sheltered areas more quickly and huddle more effectively than animals that haven't experienced such extreme conditions. Evolution in action, compressed into a single terrifying week. Stephanie Hatzenbuller's desperate plan had become a legend in North Dakota ranching circles, the story of how one woman's refusal to accept conventional limitations saved an entire herd from impossible conditions. The polar vortex of 2019 had tested the absolute limits of survival, and somehow, against all odds and expert predictions, life had found a way to persist. As spring arrived and the memory of -55 degrees faded into ranch folklore, the cattle of Diamond J grazed peacefully in their pastures, living proof that sometimes the most desperate plans become the most magnificent victories. The Arctic had done its worst, and the American prairie had responded with its best.